Good day everyone, I am Kyla Marie Gajetos, and this is our video recording presentation. Our topic is all about the Romantic period, and we aim to cover the following objectives. Effective, display understanding on the attitudes that characterizes Romanticism. Skills, analyze the works of major Romantic poets, including Shelley, Keats, Coleridge, Wordsworth, and Gray. Then the knowledge, define Romanticism, and identify its various themes. So here are the specific topics that we will tackle as we go on with our discussion. First, the background of the Romantic period. Next, the definition of odes, elegies, and lyric poetry. The poem Ode to the West Wind by P. Shelley. Ode to the Grecian Urn by John Keats. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud by Wordsworth. And lastly, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard by T. Gray. Romanticism, or the Romantic era or period, was an artistic, literary, and intellectual movement that originated in Europe toward the end of the 18th century and in most areas was at its peak in the approximate period from 1800s to 1840. Partly a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, it was also a revolt against aristocratic social and political norms of the Age of Enlightenment and a reaction against the scientific rationalization of nature. It was embodied most strongly in the visual arts, music, and literature, but had a major impact on historiography, education, and the natural sciences. Its effect on politics was considerable and complex. While for much of the peak Romantic period, it was associated with liberalism and radicalism. In the long term, its effect on the growth of nationalism was probably more significant. Romanticism in English literature began in the 1790s with the publication of the lyrical ballads of William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Wordsworth's preface to the second edition of Lyrical Ballads, in which he described poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, became the manifesto of the English Romantic movement in poetry. William Blake was the third principal poet of the movement's early phase in England. The first phase of the Romantic movement in Germany was marked by innovations in both content and literary style, and by a preoccupation with the mystical, the subconscious, and the supernatural. Among the characteristic attitudes of Romanticism were the following: a deepened appreciation of the beauties of nature, a general exaltation of emotion over reason and of the senses over intellect, a turning in upon the self, and a heightened examination of human personality and its moods and mental potentialities, a preoccupation with the genius, the hero, and the exceptional figure in general, and a focus on his or her passions and inner struggles, a new view of the artist as a supremely individual creator, whose creative spirit is more important than strict adherence to formal rules and traditional procedures, and an emphasis upon imagination as a gateway to transcendent experience and spiritual truth. To know more about the Romantic period, let us view a clip from YouTube.
This video will define Romanticism, consider the social and historical factors that led to Romanticism, identify significant romantic poets and authors, identify the major characteristics of romantic literature.
This is the story of man's escape from the shackles of commerce and industry to the freedom of nature. At a time when the world was becoming increasingly mechanized, the Romantics sought an intense relationship with the natural world. In so doing, they would revolutionize our perception of life itself.
So what led to Romanticism? Romanticism began roughly around the time of the start of the French Revolution in 1789, and it finished around 1850. Romanticism was a reaction against the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment. To be a romantic is to take the side of nature against industry. The Romantics viewed cities as grimy, ugly, and soulless. In William Blake's poem Jerusalem, he links the Industrial Revolution to the ultimate evil, the devil. And was Jerusalem builded here, among these dark satanic mills? The Romantics challenged the scientific, sociological outlook on life that was promoted during the Enlightenment. In particular, the Romantics disagreed with the Enlightenment's values of progress and rationality, especially progress as defined by technological advancement and urbanization. And just to look at a quick definition of sociology, which is the study of social behaviour or society. So I've whipped up a quick table for you to look at to measure the Enlightenment against the Romantics. The Enlightenment was all about reason. In contrast, the Romantics were about passion and emotion. The Enlightenment about human nature. The Romantics about nature itself. The Enlightenment was man overcoming nature. The Romantics was about nature being more important than man. The Enlightenment were about material possessions. The Romantics were more about spiritual. The Enlightenment was about laboratory observation. The Romantics were more about intuition and insight. So here is, a very brief sample of Romantic poets. There are lots more that I've missed out. But William Wordsworth, Lord Byron, John Keats, Christina Rossetti, all very important Romantic poets. So some Romantic authors, again, obviously there are lots more, but some important ones were Charlotte Bronte, Mary Shelley, Anne Radcliffe, and Emily Bronte. So what characterises Romantic literature? Romanticism is characterised by its emphasis on emotion, the purity of childhood, the glorification of the past and critique of progress, absolute truth, and the deification of nature. Wordsworth summed up the importance that the Romantics placed on emotion when he said that poetry began as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, which the poet then recollects in tranquility. Caspar David Friedrich, a German painter, also championed the idealization of emotion when he said, "The artist's feeling is his law." The purity of childhood. The importance of a happy and playful childhood was a belief that developed during the Romantic period. William Blake championed the innocence and spiritual purity of childhood. In the 19th century, some working-class parents sold their sons. These boys, aged between 4 to 7 years, would become chimney sweeps, which was a miserable work. Many of the sweeps became deformed or were killed due to their work. The glorification of the past and critique of progress. The cult of the Middle Ages is a significant theme in Romanticism. Romanticism revived elements of art and literature perceived as authentically medieval in an attempt to escape population growth, early urban sprawl, and industrialism. The Romanticist is on a ceaseless quest for absolute truth. As discussed, Romanticism was a movement away from the objective truths of science towards the more subjective truth of art. Ultimately, the Romanticist would discover truth in nature.
There is a pleasure in the pathless woods. There is a rapture on the lonely shore. There is society where none intrudes. By the deep sea and music in its roar. I love not man the less, but nature more. From these are interviews, in which I steal from all I may be, or have been before, to mingle with the universe, and feel what I can ne'er express, yet cannot all conceal.
So now let us move on to the definition of odes, elegies, and lyric poetry. So odes and elegies are types of lyric poetry that expresses grief or loss either at the passing of an individual or in recognition of a more abstract or metaphysical loss. Both forms have their own origins in the lyric poetry of ancient Greece. The traditional ode is usually longer than the elegy and has a more formal and elaborate style. During the Romantic period, poets such as John Keats were noted for meditative odes that allowed the poet to express his own thoughts and feelings. An ode is a formal, often ceremonious lyric poem that glorifies an individual, event, or a concept. It praises, glorifies, and venerates. It have formal structures and arouse emotions like delight, wonder, and astonishment, while elegy is a poem of serious reflection, characteristically a lament for the dead. The main difference between ode and elegy is that ode praises or glorifies someone or something, whereas elegy laments over the loss of something or someone. Elegy doesn't have a formal structure, and it arouses emotions like woe, despair, and sorrow. So there are three basic structures of odes: the Pindaric, Horatian, and the irregular odes. But let us first define Pindaric odes. It was named after the Greek poet Pindar. This ode took the form of a public poem which spoke of athletic victories and meant to be set to music. They were heroic and ecstatic. This classical ode has three major parts: the strophe, the antistrophe, and the epode. Thomas Gray's The Progress of Poesy, a Pindaric ode, and William Wordsworth's ode, Intimations of Immortality from Reflections of Early Childhood, are examples of English odes written in Pindaric style. Next is Horatian odes. It was named after the Latin poet Horace. These odes were written in quatrains. Unlike Pindaric odes, they were more detached, philosophical, and balanced. Andrew Marvell's Horatian ode upon Cromwell's return from Ireland is an example of an English ode written in Horatian style. And lastly is the irregular odes. As the name suggests, these types of odes are devoid of a set structure or formal rhyme scheme. Therefore, the poet has a lot of freedom to try different concepts and forms. Poets like John Keats and William Wordsworth used this ode structure. So now, let us define lyric poetry. Both the ode and the elegy are forms of Western lyric poetry. According to the Norton Anthology of Poetry, the word lyric is a reference to the lyre, a musical instrument meant to accompany this type of poem. The present-day lyric poem is relatively short and personal, expressing the emotions and concerns of a speaker rather than telling a dramatic narrative. Different poets have written lyric poems since their origins in ancient Greece, but the style was particularly popular during the Romantic movement in the 19th century. Here's an example of ode entitled Ode to the West Wind by Percy Bysshe Shelley. So Percy Bysshe Shelley was one of the major English Romantic poets. American literary critic Harold Bloom describes him as a superb craftsman, a lyric poet without rival, and surely one of the most advanced, skeptical intellects ever to write a poem. He is one of the epic poets of the 19th century and is best known for his classic anthology verse works such as Ode to the West Wind and The Mask of Anarchy. He is also well known for his long-form poetry, including Queen Mab and Alastor. So Percy was born on August 4, 1792 in Horsham, United Kingdom, and died on July 8, 1822 in Lerici, Italy. This poem, Ode to the West Wind by Percy Bysshe Shelley, was written at a single sitting on October 25, 1819. It was published in 1820 and considered a prime example of the poet's passionate language and symbolic imagery. The ode invokes the spirit of the west wind, destroyer and preserver, the spark of creative vitality. This ode introduced a new stanzaic form composed of 5 sonnets, each of which has 4 tercets or units of 3 lines each. The scheme is based on Italian terza rima, rhyming ABA, BCB, CDC, and DED, followed by a rhyming EE couplet. So now, let us try to analyze this poem. This first stanza, O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, thou, from whose unseen presence the leaves dead are driven, like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing. So in the opening stanza of Ode to the West Wind, the speaker appeals to the wild west wind. The use of capital letters for west and wind immediately suggests that he is speaking to the wind as though it were a person. He calls the wind the breath of autumn's being, thereby further personifying the wind and giving it the human quality of having breath. He describes the wind as having unseen presence, which makes it seem as though he views the wind as a sort of god or spiritual being. The last line of this stanza specifically refers to the wind as a spiritual being that drives away death and ghost. Okay, so now let's move on to the second stanza. Yellow and black and pale and hectic red, pestilence-stricken multitudes, O thou, who chariotest to their dark wintry bed. So this stanza describes the dead autumn leaves. They are not described as colorful and beautiful, but rather as a symbol of death and even disease. The speaker describes the deathly colors yellow, black, and pale. Even hectic red reminds one of the blood and sickness. He describes the dead and dying leaves as pestilence-stricken multitudes. So this is not a peaceful nor beautiful description of the fall leaves. Rather, the speaker seems to see the fall leaves as a symbol of the dead, the sick, and the dying. The wind then comes along like a chariot and carries the leaves to their dark wintry bed, which is clearly a symbol of a grave. So, next stanza. The winged seeds, where they lie cold and low, each like a corpse within its grave, until thine assured sister of the spring shall bow. So the speaker continues the metaphor of the leaves as the dead by explaining that the wind carries them and the winged seeds to their graves, where they lie cold and low. He then uses a simile to compare each leaf to a corpse within its grave. But then, partway through the second line, a shift occurs. The speaker says that each is like a corpse until the wind comes through, taking away the dead, but bringing new life. The use of the word azure or blue to describe the wind is in sharp contrast to the colors used to describe the leaves. Okay, so now let's move on to the fourth stanza. Her clarion o'er the dreaming earth, and feel, driving sweet buds like flocks to feed in air, with living hues and others plain and hill. So with this stanza, the speaker describes the wind as something which drives away death, burying the dead and bringing new life. So it brings living hues or living colors and odors which are filled with new life. So now let's move on to the fifth stanza of the Canto 1. There it says, "Wild spirit, which art moving everywhere, destroyer and preserver, hear, oh hear." So here, the speaker again appeals to the wind, calling it a wild spirit and viewing it as a spiritual being who destroys and yet also preserves life. So he is asking this spirit to hear his pleas. He has not yet made a specific request of the wind, but it is clear that he views it as a powerful spiritual being that can hear him. Let's proceed to Canto 2, stanza 1. Thou on whose stream, mid the steep sky's commotion, loose clouds like earth's decaying leaves are shed, shook from the tangled boughs of heaven and ocean. Again, the speaker addresses the wind as a person, calling it the one who will loose clouds and shake the leaves of the boughs of heaven and ocean. So this reads almost as a psalm, as if the speaker is praising the wind for its power. Okay, next, stanza 2. Angels of rain and lightning, there are spread on the blue surface of thine airy surge, like the bright hair uplifted from the head. So again, the speaker refers to the wind as a spiritual being more powerful than angels, for the angels of rain and lightning are described as being spread on the blue surface of the wind. He then describes these angels as being like the bright hair on the head of an even greater being. Next, stanza 3. Of some fierce Maenad, even from the dim verge of the horizon to the zenith's height, the locks of the approaching storm, thou dirge. So in this stanza of Ode to the West Wind, the speaker compares the wind to a fierce Maenad, or the spiritual being that used to be found around the Greek god Dionysus. Remember, this is the being that was also described as having hair like angels. Thus, the wind is described as a being like a god, with angels for hair. So these angels of rain and lightning reveal that a storm is on the way. Let's move on to stanza 4. Of the dying year, to which this closing night will be the dome of a vast sepulchre, vaulted with all thy congregated might. So the speaker then explains that the storm approaching is the impending doom of the dying year. The use of sepulchre is interesting too, since this is referring to a small room or monument in which a person is buried in, typically Christian origin. So to refer to something like this could suggest that Shelley wants to trap and contain all of the power of nature inside the tomb, for it to burst open in stanza 5. As well as this, a sepulchre is an isolating way of being buried, which could indicate Shelley wants to move away from all his miseries and be finally at one with nature. Okay, so stanza 5. Of vapors from whose solid atmosphere black rain and fire and hail will burst, oh hear. So the speaker then describes the wind as the bringer of death. He has already described it as the destroyer. So here, he describes it as one who brings black rain and fire and hail. Then, to end this canto, the speaker again appeals to the wind, begging that it would hear him. Canto 3, stanza 1. Thou who didst waken from his summer dreams the blue Mediterranean, where he lay, lulled by the coil of his crystalline streams. So to begin this canto, the speaker describes the wind as having woken up the Mediterranean Sea from a whole summer of peaceful rest. So the sea here is also personified, right? So next, stanza 2. Beside a Pumice isle in Bayes Bay, and saw in sleep old palaces and towers quivering within the waves' intenser day. So with this stanza, the speaker simply implies that the sea was dreaming of the old days of palaces and towers, and that he was quivering at the memory of an intenser day. So next, stanza 3. All overgrown with azure moss and flowers so sweet, the sense faints picturing them. Thou, for whose path the Atlantic's level powers. So the speaker continues to describe the sea's dreams as being of slower days when everything was overgrown with blue, moss, and flowers. Then he hints that something is about to change when he mentions to Atlantic's powers. Okay, stanzas 4 and 5 cleave themselves into chasms or chasms, while far below the sea blooms and the oozy woods which wear the sapless foliage of the ocean know thy voice and suddenly grow gray with fear, and tremble and despoil themselves, O here. So, this stanza of Ode to the West Wind is in reference to the sea's reaction to the power of the wind. At the first sign of the strong wind, the sea seems to cleave into chasms and grow gray with fear as they tremble at the power of the wind. Again, this stanza reflects a psalm in the worship of a God so mighty that nature itself trembles in its sight. Next, Canto 4. If I were a dead leaf, thou mightest bear. If I were a swift cloud to fly with thee, a wave to pant beneath thy power and share. So here, the speaker finally brings his attention to himself. He imagines that he was a dead leaf, which the wind might carry away, or a cloud which the wind might blow. So he thinks about what it would be like to be a wave at the mercy of the power of the wind. Okay, next stanza. The impulse of thy strength, only less free than thou, O uncontrollable. If even I were as in my boyhood and could be. So the speaker stands in awe of the wondrous strength of the wind. It seems to act on impulse, and its strength is uncontrollable. So he then mentions his own childhood. Next, stanza 3. The comrade of thy wanderings over heaven, as then, when to outstrip thy sky speed, scarce seemed a vision I would never have striven. Here, the speaker seems to wonder whether the wind has gotten stronger since his childhood, or whether he has simply become weaker. So he thinks that when he was a boy, he may have been about to outstrip the speed of the wind, and yet his boyhood seemed a vision, so distant and so long ago. So the speaker is clearly contrasting the strength of the wind to his own weakness that has come upon him as he has aged. So next stanza. as thus with thee in prayer in my sore need. Oh, lift me as a wave, a leaf, a cloud. I fall upon the thorns of life. I bleed. Here, the speaker finally comes to his request. Until now, he has been asking the wind to hear him, but he has not made any specific request. Now, he compares himself to a man in prayer in his sore need, and he begs the wind to lift him as a wave, a leaf, and a cloud. So he longs to be at the mercy of the wind, whatever may come of it. In the final line, he refers to himself as one who is in the final stages of his life when he says, I fall upon the thorns of life. I bleed. Just like the wind swept away the dead leaves of the autumn, the speaker calls for the wind to sweep him away, old and decaying as he is. Next, stanza 5. A heavy weight of ours has chained and bowed one to like thee, tameless and swift and proud. So here, the speaker says that the weight of all of his years of life have bowed him down, even though he was once like the wind, as he describes in the last stanza. In the last line, tameless and swift and proud. Okay, next, Canto 5, so stanza 1. Make me die a liar, even as the forest is. What if my leaves are falling like its own? The tumult of thy mighty harmonies. Again, the speaker begs the wind to make him be at its mercy. He wants to be like a lyre or harp played by the wind. So he wants to be like the dead leaves which fall to the ground when the wind blows. Next stanza. We'll take from both a deep, autumnal tone, sweet though in sadness. Be thou, spirit fierce, my spirit, be thou me, impetuous one. So in this stanza, the speaker asked the wind to come into him and make him alive. This is yet another reference to the wind as a sort of God. In some religions, particularly the Christian religion, there is the belief that to have a new life, one must receive the Holy Spirit into his bodily being. This is precisely what the speaker is asking the wind to do to him. So he realizes that for this to happen, his old self would be swept away. That is why he describes this as sweet though in sadness. But he asks the spirit of the wind to be his own spirit and to be one with him. Next, third stanza. Drive my dead thoughts over the universe like withered leaves to quicken a new birth. And by the incantation of this verse. So, the speaker asked the wind to drive his dead thoughts over the universe, so that even as he dies, others might take his thoughts and his ideas and give them new birth. So he thinks that perhaps this might even happen with the very words he is speaking now. Next, stanza 4. Scatter, as from an unextinguished hearth, ashes and sparks, my words among mankind, be through my lips to an unawakened earth. So here the speaker asks the wind to scatter his thoughts as ashes and sparks, that his words might kindle a fire among mankind, and perhaps awaken the sleeping earth. Last stanza. The trumpet of a prophecy, O wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? Okay, so the speaker has used spiritual and biblical references throughout this poem, entitled Ode to the West Wind, to personify the wind as a god. But here, he makes it a little more specific when he says the trumpet of prophecy. So, he is specifically referring to the end of the world as the Bible describes it. When the trumpet of prophecy is blown, Christ is believed to return to earth to judge the inhabitants. The speaker asked the wind to blow the trumpet. Because of the speaker's tone throughout Ode to the West Wind, it would make sense if this was the speaker's own personal trumpet, marking the end of his life. So he wants the wind to blow this trumpet. With the last two lines of Ode to the West Wind, the speaker reveals why he has begged the wind to take him away in death. He says, "If winter comes, can spring be far behind?" So this reveals his hope that there is an afterlife for him. He desperately hopes that he might leave behind his dying body and enter into a new life after his death. So it is somehow called as a rebirth of life. Okay, that's all for the analysis of this poem. So this is now the summary of the poem, Ode to the West Wind by Percy Bysshe Shelley. So the speaker invokes the wild west wind of autumn, which scatters the dead leaves and spreads seeds so that they may be nurtured by the spring, and asks that the wind, a destroyer and preserver, hear him. The speaker calls the wind the dirge or of the dying year, and describes how it stirs up violent storms, and again implores it to hear him. The speaker says that the wind steers the Mediterranean from his summer dreams and cleaves the Atlantic into choppy chasms, making the subtlest foliage of the ocean tremble, and ask for a third time that it hear him. So the speaker says that if he were a dead leaf that the wind could bear, or a cloud it could carry, or a wave it could push, or even if he were as a boy the comrade of the winds wandering over heaven, then he would never have needed to pray to the wind and invoke its powers. He pleads with the wind to lift him as a wave, a leaf, a cloud, for though he is like the wind at heart, untamable and proud, he is now chained and bowed with the weight of his hours upon the earth. The speaker asks the wind to make Medea a lyre, to be his own spirit, and to drive his thoughts across the universe, like withered leaves to quicken a new birth. He asks the wind by the incantation of this verse to scatter his words among mankind, to be the trumpet of a prophecy, speaking both in regard to the season and in regard to the effect upon mankind, that he hopes his words to have. The speaker asks, "If winter comes, can spring be far behind?" Okay, so the themes of the poems are death, rebirth, and poetry. So Shelley engages with themes of death, rebirth, and poetry in Ode to the West Wind. From the start, Shelley's speaker describes the wind as something powerful and destructive. It takes away the summer and brings winter, a season usually associated with death and sorrow. So it's not a peaceful wind, he adds. But despite this, the speaker celebrates it. It is necessary for the circle of life to progress. Without death, there is no rebirth, right? The wind serves an important role in preserving this. Poetry is one of the less obvious themes in Ode to the West Wind. The speaker seems to allude to a process of creation in the text, one that involves him personally. So this might, considering the format, be the creation of poetry.